Welcome to the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you level up your instruction in order to craft authentic learning experiences for both you and your students. I'm your host, Lee Tucker, a high school English teacher and ed tech enthusiast, and I want to join you on your journey to becoming the best instructor that you possibly can. So if you're ready, grab your adventuring gear and let's get going. Hey, what is up, 8-Bit crew? Today is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020, and this is episode 6 of the 8-Bit Instructor. Today, we're going to take a look later on at the history of grading. That's something that has been on my mind for a few years now. But before we get into that, we'll take a look at some news and updates and open up the treasure chest and learn a little something new. So, news and updates, a few different updates from around, personal updates. You know, we just started into our school year with students back, and I'm teaching kind of a combination hybrid of face-to-face students with some virtual students in those classes as well. And it is a pretty stressful situation. But one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about over the last few days is the idea of just kind of being stressed out about all of this. Because what I realized is one of the reasons I am stressed out is because I still want to put together the best quality material that I can for all of my students. And it got me thinking about other teachers in similar situations. So I just wanted to offer up a little bit of encouragement and say, you know, if you're teaching virtual, teaching face-to-face, teaching a combination of both, and are getting really stressed out about doing so, keep in mind that the reason that you are probably stressed out is because you want to do the best job possible. But keep in mind that perfection maybe is not the end goal that we can look for. If you are overly stressing yourself out, you're probably going to end up doing what I'd say, not a worse job, but it's going to distract you and all that. So put your best effort into the things that you are doing, but also realize that it won't be perfect. And at some point, we just have to be okay and accept what we do produce for our students, and know that what we put out there to them is our best effort and our best quality. And as long as we are putting our best out there, we don't need to stress out about how good or bad it is, which I know is a lot easier said than done, but it's something that I felt needed saying. So on to some other news and updates with education and ed tech. So Quizizz just announced a new feature on their website. If you are unfamiliar with Quizizz, it's a online kind of game, multiple choice platform, similar to Kahoot. If any of you have played Kahoot, Quizizz, allows you to create multiple choice questions, and students can click through an answer. They get points based on how quickly they answer correct questions and all that. They are rolling out a lessons feature now. So it looks, from reading up on it, it looks very similar to something you would see on Nearpod or Pear Deck. So you can create a lesson for students and set up adding slides with text. You can add interactive questions that go along with that. They have it set up so you can add media, pictures, videos, audio, anything like that. And what you can get in the end, which was a great feature from their game platform, is you've got the leaderboard and end of session report. So you can export information, any of those interactive questions that you've put in there, you see the results. So it is very much like what you would see in Nearpod and in Pear Deck. It's just embedded in Quizizz now. So if you use Quizizz in your class, definitely check out that lesson feature. I haven't had a chance to look at it on the website itself, but just reading about it seems pretty interesting and like something that would be an effective way to do some virtual lessons potentially. In some Google news from the Keyword blog, if you use Android and use the Google Play Store, they've actually added a kids section to their categories, which is cool because now you've got a section for little ones. If you've got young kids or if you teach young kids, that helps parents find what they call teacher approved apps for their kids. So these are a lot of apps that have been highlighted as beneficial for young students and all that. So like I said, if you have young kids and you're on Android devices, check out the Google Play Store. There's a new kids section there that has a lot of useful apps that you could have for your students to improve and play on stuff that is closer to what they would be doing in class. Additionally, Google has improved some of their collaborative efforts in Google Drive, Docs, Sheets, and all that. They're making a visitor sharing option now to allow non-Google accounts to collaborate. So this is a big change because previously you could share a document with another Google account to collaborate. They can edit and all that, but it was just limited to Google accounts. Now they will have settings set up to allow you to share outside of the Google domains, which can help just broaden the collaborative process with some of those outside. So one of the things that they said on the blog is G Suite customers often work with partners outside of their company who don't always have Google accounts. So if you're, take for example, working with parents on something, parents may not necessarily have a Google account. So if they're using some other email account, it would allow you to have them in for collaboration efforts on certain documents or anything like that. And then finally, Google has also, for some accessibility features, improved Braille support in Google Docs, which is a pretty cool thing. So there's a new shortcut, Control-Alt-H, to toggle the Braille support. When you use shortcuts to navigate, it will now announce where your cursor moves to, including comments, headings, misspellings, suggestions. They improved the reliability of navigating through lengthy documents with that. Images, misspellings, grammar errors are now verbalized directly by the assistive technology. And they've also improved the navigation and selection verbalizations when moving through tables and selecting content. So something like announcing an entire cell's content. So improving those accessibility features to make all of their apps available to as many people as possible. So pretty cool little feature going on there with Google as well. So that will pretty much take care of our news and updates. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have in today's treasure chest. So today's treasure chest, little golden nugget of wisdom, is actually a Google Chrome extension. It is the Share to Classroom extension. And I've used this a lot. I really love this extension. What it does is it allows you, if you're on any kind of web page, the extension allows you to directly send that to Google Classroom. You can create an announcement, you can create an assignment out of it. So instead of having to open a tab, click through, go to Classroom, go to your class period, copy and paste the link in there. If you found something, say an article that you want your students to read, you can just use this extension to create whatever that is in Google Classroom. So like I said, an announcement in the stream, an assignment in the classwork section, you can do all of that. One of the features that I love about this is the ability to send the page directly to students. So there is a feature in this Share to Classroom extension that when you click on it, any student who is logged into a Chromebook on their account that is a part of your Google Classroom, it will open that page up on their computer. So it's the push to students feature, which is really cool because it always freaks my students out the first time that I do it, when they're working or doing something and then all of a sudden a page pops up that I'm talking about and they're all like, how did you do that? And it's fun to mess with them that way. But that's a cool feature to be able to do if you want to quickly like have something pop up for them. So that's a great little extension, the Share to Classroom extension. So check that out, give it a try, and that will take care of today's treasure chest. So today's featured content is actually kind of a lead-in for an interview that I'll have next week. But it's just something that has been on my mind a lot. So today's boss battle, we're taking a look at grades. Today's featured content is a topic that has been on my mind a lot over the last several years. And one of the things that has gotten me thinking about this actually has to do with two groups of students that I teach, those being my highest achieving students and my lowest achieving students. And I'm talking about this today because next week I actually have an interview with Steve Capone, who is doing some interesting things with this idea. And the idea that I'm looking at today is grading. So I'm taking a cursory look into the history of grading. This is by no means an exhaustive study on it because I have not gone super in depth with it, but I have been reading up on it some. And I planned to read more into this because the concept of grading has just been a strange one for me. So I wanted to start with essentially kind of where grading came from, at least in what we would consider our current educational culture. So a lot of this started back in about the mid-19th century. Before 1850, grades and reporting were virtually unknown in the U.S. And if you think about it, grading, it started coming around the late 1800s, but thousands of years prior to this, education had been going on without things like report cards, right? So keeping that in mind, I took a look into what developed from around the 1850s to today. So throughout the 19th century, students of all ages, all backgrounds were put together into this single-room schoolhouse with one single teacher. Talk about, a differentiation nightmare there. But they would have their class, they would teach, and essentially what they would do is they would just orally explain to parents the student's learning progress. So it was based mostly on just this narrative. So this, your student has come in, has developed her writing skills very well. Reading skills have gone pretty well. Could probably use a little bit more work in math. So it was very anecdotal, very narrative driven. But there was no means by which student performance in one school could be compared with the performance elsewhere. So around that time, different universities like Yale, William & Mary, Harvard started experimenting with point scales to keep an average of students' marks, which essentially was the precursor to the GPA system that we have today. So they would score them on a different scale. Some would be 3-point scales or 4-point scales. There were some 9-point scales and so on. So different schools were using these different scaling systems. But one of the things that happened in the late 1800s was that the number of students began to dramatically increase. So as student numbers increased, schools started grouping students by grades and developing some curriculum to go along with it. So it was no longer just everybody in the area in a single schoolroom. They started dividing them out. And during that time, teachers started writing down, a list of skills that students in these different grade levels would master and which ones needed more work. So, probably kind of the introduction of something like standards and standard-based grading. So, in these different areas, these are the things that students would learn at different age groups, at different grade levels. And the point of this was to give students an idea of what they needed to do before moving on to the next level. Now, that was all well and good until around the late 1800s when compulsory attendance laws began to be enacted. So these compulsory attendance laws were passed for elementary level education. And when this happened, the number of students who entered high school skyrocketed. And from 1870 to 1910, in the span of 40 years, the number of public high schools went from 500 to 10,000. So we're talking about a huge increase of high school students during this 40 years. And so during that time, subject content areas started to become more specific and percentages came into play to show how students were doing in those various areas. So we began dividing English and math and science out into separate classes and then giving them percentages on how they scored. And then this became the norm, and few educators questioned it at the time. So even as far back as 1912, researchers began questioning the effectiveness and the reliability of these grades. So these two guys, Daniel Starch and Edward Charles Eliot, found that different teachers in different schools were giving a wide range of grades on two identical papers from students. So what they did is they took two papers that were written by students and they gave them to different teachers from different areas and all that. The first paper, the grade on it ranged from a 64 to a 98. The second paper ranged from a 50 to a 97. So we're talking upwards of almost 50 points of difference on the same exact paper. And part of the reason is, some focused on elements of grammar and style, while others looked at the overall message. And speaking as an English teacher, I can really understand how difficult that can be. Even as specific as a standard might get for writing, it's still really hard and it's very subjective to look at what is done effectively versus what is done ineffectively, who's the audience being written to. And so grading something like an essay tends to be, can add that variety, that discrepancy between scores. But other subject areas are easier, right? Math is very concrete. It's very straightforward. So there should be no discrepancies in that, right? Well, these guys did a similar study a year later in the field of geometry. So they did the same thing. They took student work and they gave them to different teachers, had them score them, had them grade them. The variation on that was even greater than what it was on the English papers. And one paper that they gave around, there was a discrepancy between a grade from a 28 to a 95. That is a huge difference in scoring one single identical assignment. And again, part of the reason some teachers deducted points just for wrong answers. Others took in ideas like neatness, form, spelling into consideration as a part of the grade. But again, the discrepancy even between that's a huge number that it should be at least somewhat close. I think we would all agree. And so we could just say, focus on the correct answers, but think about things like, even in math, what about showing your work? Are we just grading a student getting the correct answer? Are we grading the process that they determine that answer? Are we grading which specific process? If there are multiple ways to solve an equation, are we factoring that into the grading? There's a lot of gray area even in something like that. So this discrepancy led from, instead of doing a percentage kind of thing, they integrated more of a scale-based system that created fewer but broader categories. And essentially this is where we got our current system. So the whole A, B, C, D, F system came essentially from this scale score rating. Which, as a side note, I love how we felt the need to skip an E in letter grading so that we could really, really solidify that F for failure, right? Maybe I have to research into. I don't understand why E was skipped, but anyway, so the system moved from a percentage-based thing to more of a letter graded, point graded kind of system. So that all sounds easy and great, but even after that, there came even more controversy and the debate intensified even further. And so even more things were brought into grading. So we came into using things like the bell curve to ensure that there was an even distribution of grades, even to the point where in some places they literally sat down and took the percentages of the bell curve and made sure that those percentages were used in the types of grades that students were getting. Grading on a curve became more of an acceptable thing because that's how things like intelligent test scores are done. So why not do that for student learning and all that? Some schools abolished formal grades altogether. Some of them went back to the verbal description narrative that was originally used, where they just kind of described the progress that students were making. Others even moved into a simple pass-fail system. You either showed that you knew enough to pass or you didn't. And then others advocated the mastery-based approach, which is the one that is very popular today, where students have a set of skills to master, and then once they've mastered that, they were able to move on to the next level. But the lack of consensus in this grading policy has led to a wide variety of things that teachers do when they're grading and reporting. So In some places we have things like letter grades. In some places it's numbers, just like a 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of them use descriptors like beginning, developing, proficient, distinguished, which here in Georgia is what we get back on like our state milestones, are those different kind of descriptors. But that also leads into the question of what should factor into a grade for a course. So are we just grading their ability to master a standard? If so, what about the progress made from the beginning of year to the end of the year? If I have a student in one of my literature classes who begins the year reading on a 5th grade level and by the end of the year is on an 8th grade level, is that considered passing? Or since they're still not at a high school level, do they still fail even though they made tremendous progress? Same thing with something like writing. Same thing with something like math. If a student is not able to do some basic computations and they're sitting in an algebra class and they start to make a lot of progress but still haven't gotten quite up to that, are we factoring that in any to the end result? What about something like work ethic, the amount of work and effort and time that students put into learning and getting better? What about learning ability? If we have students with special needs, are they expected to make the same amount of progress, the same standards? All of those questions come up when we start to talk about something even as simple as mastering a standard for a class. In addition to all of that, there's this issue of what we call grade inflation. And this is actually what really got me looking into grades a few years ago. So there's this phenomenon called grade inflation where it originally kind of came from is private versus public schools. And the phenomenon here is that the average grades at a private school are higher than those in a public school. Now, the assumption and what people will claim is that, private schools have very strict selectivity. They're able to decide who comes to their school, who can't come to their school. They have expectations, and students who aren't meeting those expectations can be kicked out. So the assumption there is that the student body in a private school is smarter, better, all of that kind of stuff to begin with, which is why their GPAs are higher. However, a man named Stuart Rajstasher, I don't know that I'm saying that name correctly, but it'll be in the show notes. He did a study that found even when schools had the same degree of selectivity, the difference between private and public schools was the same, that private schools still had higher GPAs than public schools, even though they had the same basic type of student body. And so the question then becomes, well, why is that? And even a lot of faculty members at private schools have complained about the pressure to raise grades beyond what is observed, not just from administration, but students and probably even parents. And if you think about it, like that's what my experience has been to a lesser degree. I noticed this when I started teaching honors courses a handful of years ago. I would get in these classes and I would have students who would have B's, students who were accustomed to making A's all the time and just were not, in my opinion, putting in the effort or not hitting the standards as well as they should have. So they would have a mid to high B. And I would always hear, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard the same exact question. You can probably say it along with me right now as I'm saying it. What do I need to do to get an A? And I always hated hearing that question because to me, that was not a desire to learn and grow. It was just a desire to see what is the bare minimum I need to do to get an A. And so it became more about the grade instead of the learning and the growing. And even now, it's almost like an A has become the norm rather than the exception. The idea of an A is that these are people who are going above and beyond, whether it's work ethic, whether it's learning, and all of that. But even on the opposite side of the spectrum, I've noticed a similar but kind of opposite idea in my struggling, more lower achieving students, that there's this kind of pressure to increase the grades of the lower functioning students who struggle in a class to ensure that they're making their way through, almost whether they are mastering the skills or not. And that's not even to mention the motivational factors that a student has coming into class on the first day and expecting to get an F because they know that they struggle in that class. So all of that really got me thinking about my own grading practices and grading policies, because from my point of view, I want to do the most to help my students be motivated to learn and get better. So, what exactly does the research say about all of this? There's been a ton of research that has been done about grading policies and the grading process. Most of it is done through teacher surveys. And although there's a lot of inconsistencies in the quality and the results of the surveys, there have been some key points of agreement that have trended across the board from a lot of teachers that gives me some talking points and some questions to think about when I am putting grading policies into place. The first one is that they noticed in a lot of these research surveys is that grading and reporting are not essential to the instructional process. And I would be willing to bet that a lot of you in the classroom understand that point, that I don't need a grade on a paper to understand what my students know and don't know. Teachers don't need grades in order to teach well, and students don't need grades in order to learn well. Learning is the process, not the grade that's put on it. Now, there's a lot of research and a lot of stuff out there that really shows that regular checking of progress is essential to successful teaching. So some of that stuff like formative assessments, where we're checking what our students know and don't know, that is key to the learning process. But progress monitoring, checking of progress, and grading are not the same thing necessarily. The second point that has come out of a lot of this is that grading and reporting grades serve a variety of purposes, but there is no one method that does them all well. So grading and reporting are used to communicate achievements to parents, to provide information to students for self-evaluation purposes. They can be used to select and identify students for certain educational paths or goals. They can provide incentives for students to learn. They can also serve as documents of student performance to evaluate the effectiveness of instructional programs. But one single system does not do all five of those very well. Take something like a letter grade. If we just throw a letter grade, A, B, C, whatever on there, that is very effective for communicating achievement to parents. That gives a very clear, quick way of parents knowing how a student is doing, but that doesn't necessarily give a student an effective self-evaluation in order to understand what they know or don't know. Something like a percentage or something on a test may not effectively show actual student performance to evaluate how effective a program is. Factors like where they started and where they ended are not really shown on something like that. So we have these different options, but what is our purpose in using them? The third thing that they found was that grading and reporting are inherently subjective, and I think a lot of you guys understand that too. And to put this out there, subjectivity is not always inherently bad. Something like holistic grading can be subjective, but it can give a very accurate representation of what a student has learned when we factor in a lot of different things rather than just one single thing. But at the same time, subjective grading can be skewed as well. If when it comes down to, well, this student scored an 88, but 2 more points puts them at an A, that's sometimes where subjective grading can have a negative impact on the whole system. And then the final thing that they saw in a lot of these studies is that grades do have some value as a reward, but they don't have any value as a punishment. So while we would love all of our students to be intrinsically motivated and learn just because they want to learn, grades do offer some type of extrinsic motivation for students that need it. Students who are not inherently motivated to do better and learn more, if they have a goal that they want to reach, a B in a class or an A in a class, it can give them that concrete goal to strive for. But at the same time, there has been no study at all that has shown that low grades as a punishment are effective. And in fact, instead of promoting students to work harder, typically they end up withdrawing and trying even less. And I say that to say, think about what happens if a student gets a 0 on an assignment. And we can get into the debate about, well, they didn't do anything, they don't deserve it, whatever. Think about what happens with the student themselves. They get a 0. They feel internally that there is absolutely no chance that they can make up for that. So what's the point in even trying? And so a lot of times students just straight up give up at that point without anything else. And again, that goes back to our whole purpose for giving the grades that we are giving, for, why are we grading? And so those are just some of my thoughts. I know there are a lot of schools of thought out there about what we should grade, why we should grade, how we should grade. But it is something that has actually been on my mind a lot over the last few years. It's something that I want to dig deeper into to help my students become the best that they possibly can. And so with that being said, that will kind of end this boss battle, which will lead me right into this week's question of the week in the 8-Bit Crew Members Board. So what I want to know from you guys this week is, what is your take on grading? Think about the purpose of it. Are we grading just for skills? Are we grading for overall work ethic? Are we grading for progress from beginning to end? But also in practice, what does that look like? Do we use percentages? Do we just assign A, B, C? Do we give just a pass or fail? What's your opinion? Reach out to me on Twitter. You can tag me at Comic Socks and use the hashtag 8-Bit Crew. If you have longer posts, you can leave them in the comments section on the 8bitinstructor.com webpage for this episode. But let me know. I'm curious to see what a lot of folks out there think in regards to grading. Well, that will just about do it for this episode. Hey, make sure to tune in next week. Next week, I've got Steve Capone on with me. He's going to talk about some different methods of grading that he's actually using in his class. And he's got some interesting ideas to go along with that. And it's some really good stuff that you could easily implement into your class. Also, if you are teaching online and need some help utilizing Google Classroom, make sure to check out my Udemy course on Google Classroom, and I have some promo codes in the show notes that can get you a discount or free version of that class. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to hit subscribe and tune in on your normal podcast app, as well as leave a review for me. More importantly, tell others. Make sure we all get connected out there. And if you want to support the show, then just visit my Patreon page at www.patreon.com/8bitinstructor. Well, it's been fun. Keep getting out there and leveling up your craft. Stay safe, and until next week, keep your sword sharp and your shield strong. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and check out the 8-Bit Instructor YouTube channel for EdTech tips and tutorials, as well as other content on my website, 8bitinstructor.com. And of course, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at ComicSocks and use the hashtag 8bitcrew. See you next week.